We need it. Okay. All right, we'll use the mic. So as a counselor, I'm used to talking more one-on-one, so this is a different experience from we were just chatting about public speaking over there. But I just want to start off by saying that, we're going to kind of dive in first with, I'm the divorce part of the presentation, so you'll hear a little bit more about the happier end of things in a little bit. But I'm going to talk a little bit about how divorce, how separation impacts youth. Obviously, there's no one-size-fits-all answer to this. Every kid is different, every family is different, there's cultural influences. Oh, great, here we go. So we can definitely do a Q&A for more specific information later, but this is just kind of some general stuff. Like mentioned, I work at 360 Youth Services. We're a nonprofit in the community since 1971. We work with youth ages 10 to 25. So a lot of the flavor of my talk will just come from my experience working with kids at our office as well. And of course, I looked up some research on divorce. Let's see how this works. All right, so in a perfect scenario, perfect world, we do know that kids do better if they have the opportunity to live in a two-parent home. However, the truth is that even many married households are not necessarily happy environments. So we want to keep that perspective when we're thinking about the doom and gloom of divorce. Exposure to any kind of parent conflict, so even if the family stays married, also has long-term consequences for children. So even if the parents stay married, if there's a lot of fighting, we still see that some kids have adjustment issues with that. Second, although there are some differences in the average psychological well-being of children from happily married families and divorced families, it's also true that the majority of kids whose parents get divorced do end up faring just fine. Sorry, it's hard with holding the mic. So we want to keep in mind that divorce is a process, so it's not just this singular event, as I'm sure you realize. So it's a long process that affects people at different times. For some kids, the stress predates even separation because of the high conflict or even the violence that's been going on in the parents' marriage. However, the majority of children seem to have little emotional preparation for their parents' separation, and they react to the separation with distress, anxiety, sometimes anger, shock, or just disbelief. But typically these are just crisis-like responses, and after a year or two, we see them dissipate for kids. So again, keeping in mind all kids are different, but I wanted to list some things that kids might experience if their family's going through a divorce. I'm not going to read them all to you because I know you can do that. So these are some common things. Again, most of these things would disappear after a year or two, but at any point, and we're going to talk a little bit at the end about some do's and don'ts type things, but these are signs that if these are on the extreme end of when you would want to reach out for support, if possible through a trained counselor or therapist. All right, so what are some reasons why some kids maybe are more impacted than others? So things like how much fighting was going on in the marriage before the separation. An example of that is, let's say that there's a lot of fighting in the home before the parents separate. The separation or divorce might actually bring some relief to the kids because that fighting is now not happening in day-to-day life. Versus if there was no fighting and the kids were shielded a lot from that, their adjustment might be a little bit more extreme after the separation because it's come out of nowhere for them. They didn't know that their parents weren't doing okay. Other stressors that we want to keep in mind of, does the separation or divorce mean that the child has to move? Do they have to switch schools? Are finances now impacted? We see some kids have to change their activities, things they were able to do before, music lessons, sports, and now there's just not the money to be able to do that. Changing friend groups, things like that. A big one is how the parents are adjusting or coping, which we'll get to. And then just children's own resilience. So even before the separation or divorce, how were the kids doing? We know some kids just have a temperament which causes them to be able to bounce back from things a little bit easier or have some protective factors. Some kids are good at reaching out for help. They're kind of wired to want to talk to someone when they're upset versus isolate, things like that. So those are all factors that could could play a role in why some kids struggle more than others. So some protective factors. So the quality parenting is a big one. So one of the best predictors of children's psychological functioning following a divorce is how well the psychological adjustment is for the parent that they're living with. So who are the parent that they're spending the most time with, and what kind of parenting are they receiving when they're there? Particular parenting behaviors that are noted in the research to be very helpful are showing warmth toward the kids, emotional support, adequate monitoring, maintaining age-appropriate expectations for kids, and authoritative discipline, which means it's consistent, it's not punitive, you're focused on teaching rather than punishing. Research also shows that timely and appropriate parenting from the parent that the child does not live with is also a protective factor. It's not just about how often they see the other parent, but the quality of those experiences. So when the two parents are exchanging, bringing one kid to the other parent, is that time filled with a lot of stress and conflict versus a really smooth transition? Okay, it's time to go hang out with this parent. And the other factor is what's actually going on during that time. Is it just visits, or is the other parent truly still parenting that child? So we see that kids do better when the second parent is still very involved. They're still doing homework with them, doing activities, versus it's just a fun visit that kind of like hanging out with a different adult in their life. All right. So as I've said a couple times, we're wanting to diminish the conflict as much as possible, which can be tough if you're going through a separation or divorce, but it really is one of the huge factors for kids if parents are able to not fight during this process. So there's two parenting approaches that are really talked about as far as how to help parents navigate this co-parenting situation. The first one is called cooperative parenting, and this is best for parents who are able to get along pretty well with each other, and they have a goal of how they want to raise their children together. Often they have similar parenting styles, similar routines for their kids. This doesn't mean they're on the same page about everything, but that overall they can be cooperative with one another. On the other hand, if there is a lot of conflict and that's just not possible, the other approach is called parallel parenting. So this is for people who do have a lot of conflict. They find it very difficult to speak to each other without being engulfed in these antagonistic type conversations and yelling. But they both want to have an ongoing relationship with their children, which would be best for the kids if possible. But because of this high conflict, they need to have less direct contact with each other. So this parenting plan needs to be structured to be very specific, very detail-oriented compared to the cooperative parenting approach. The goal is really to support the disengagement of the parents so there's less opportunity for conflict. Rules are established to help them figure out how are we going to talk. Maybe it's only over email or only over text. There's nothing in person or nothing on the phone. It varies by family, but just figuring out a system of how are we going to co-parent together with the least amount of conflict possible. So I stumbled across a couple studies where they interviewed some young adults, both kids who were in college and then just college-age youth who are working, and talked to them about their experiences of growing up in a household where their parents did divorce. Compared with students that they interviewed that were in still married homes, these kids did report more painful childhood feelings and experiences, and they worried about present things even such as their upcoming college graduation, worrying about what it would be like to have both their parents together and for that situation. They did not blame themselves for their parents' divorce, and mostly thought that the divorce was right for their parents. Feelings of loss were most prevalent, and they missed not having more time with their other parent, typically their dads, and they reported feeling like they weren't sure that their dads loved them. Among factors associated with the more pain with the students were with the students who only grew up with one parent having custody of them, and where there was a lot of conflict between both the parents after the divorce. I bring this up because it's important, as adults that you might be talking with other adults and we hear people bring up stories of their childhood and what it was like when their parents get divorced. And it's worth noting that just because someone says something was painful for them and maybe they have some really tough memories, that doesn't mean that they're not well adjusted and doing well. So things can be really painful for kids, but that doesn't mean that they're going to grow up and have all kinds of problems or not being able to have successful relationships or jobs and things like that. So basically just wanted to sum up that there's tons and tons of studies out there, and that I feel that it's safe to say that the majority of children whose parents do get divorced continue to fall within the average range of adjustment for kids. So when divorce is needed, most kids do okay. But wanted to end with some do's and don'ts for helping your kids or kids that that you care about in your community, your friends, family. Some tips for going through a divorce. So we want to make sure to not ask a kid to communicate from one parent to the other, which a lot of people, when we talk about this in counseling, say like, well, of course I wouldn't do that. But it's the little things that a lot of our kids in counseling bring up that seem minor to a parent, but that really do impact them. So even just stuff like, oh, well, did your dad say like what time he's picking you up? Like something as benign as that still feels like I'm having to communicate for both my parents because they're not able to talk to one another. So it's not just the big stuff of talking really badly about the other parent, it's just using them kind of as the emotional translator, logistical translator in the family. We do want to encourage kids to ask questions and have conversations. Again, divorce isn't just a one-time event, it's a process, so bringing it up often. Not just one time a year of how are things going, but really giving kids a voice of how is this experience affecting you, how is this routine working out, things like that. They shouldn't be in charge of things, but just given an outlet to talk about it, but we don't want to push them to talk about it all the time if they say, I don't want to talk about it, I'm good, or I'm talking to so-and-so about it. We don't want to ask kids to take sides. We do want to encourage, when possible and appropriate, I know someone's going to talk about domestic violence, so we always have to have that lens of if there are reasons kids shouldn't have contact with someone, that's a different story. But when possible, it's important that kids still keep their relationships with the other sides of their family as they did before the separation. We don't want to talk negatively about the other parent, even if a lot of times kids say what this will look like in a kid or for how long it'll last. We really want to rely on the parent who knows their kid, what do you think? But if there's any sign that things just seem a little too severe or the kid's really shutting down, not talking to anybody, that you would reach out and try to get them someone to talk to. It's also just helpful to have a neutral person that's not emotionally triggered. I mean, the parent is typically struggling, and this is a very difficult time for them. So if they need a neutral person to talk to, someone in their community, a family member, someone at their church. It doesn't have to be a counselor necessarily, but if there's someone who can just non-judgmentally listen and be there for them. Reassuring them that this decision to separate or divorce has nothing to do with them, it's not their fault. Again, that would be an ongoing theme that's talked about. Especially younger kids struggle with this. Even if you tell them this, they still struggle to really get that it's not about them. Some kids. Don't go to the child as your support system, so we want to make sure that the parents are able to have outlets and friends and professional help if needed, so that they're there for their kids. That doesn't mean they have to not have emotions in front of their kids, but that they're able to not ask them for comfort while you're crying and things like that. And then lastly is do allow your child to express their feelings and answer any general questions that would be appropriate for their age. So I think that one's kind of woven all throughout. So that's it for the formal part of the presentation.
Thank you so much.
We're going to do questions
we'll
at
do
the
it
end.
later, yeah.
Okay. All right.
Psychologist with over 15 years of professional experience in the field of clinical psychology. She has earned her doctorate degree from Illinois School of Professional